We continue in 1 Kings 5 today and complete the chapter as the text shifts radically from the conversation at a distance between Solomon and Hiram of Tyre to arrange for the materials and laborers to build the temple. And suddenly we're hearing a list of all the forced labor that King Solomon gathered together for the sake of building the temple. It's quite a shift, and we'll see how Solomon is portrayed from a different text as Pharaoh. So you haven't been watching the introductory video or the ones for this unit, I really encourage you to go over the ones where I go over not just the outline of this reign, and we'll look at it all the way from 5 to 12. This chart only goes up through 11, but 12 involves Jeroboam's rebellion, which will be key for what I'll mention today. As I've been noting in the introductory video, there are parts of this that we're not going to look at in detail, especially chapter 6 and 7, which in the Hebrew are not well preserved. Many of the words we don't know what they mean, and it's unclear, despite the fact that your Bible in English gives you a translation. The actual Hebrew is unclear. But either way, the issue that we're concerned with here isn't so much the details of the actual shapes and structures of the building, but how the temple in Jerusalem compares to the wilderness tabernacle in Exodus. Let's look at that right now just for a minute. I've gone over this and it's posted at radicalbible.net, so I won't go over it in detail here. But the point I'm trying to make here is there are clear parallels between the tabernacle, the wilderness Mishkan, in the story of Exodus, as you can see, and the building of the temple here, the Bayit Yahweh, or the house of Yahweh, or the Haikal, more precisely a word for temple. One of the questions we've been looking at, and I go over in the introductory video, and I'll mention it again today, is which came first? Many scholars, I think rather naively, or just having not necessarily thought it through, suggest that the Mishkan is anticipating the temple, and so it's like a practice version. And some people even see Israel's journey from Sinai to Zion, like they were practicing in the wilderness for what emerges in Jerusalem. That's one way to put it. But another way to put it, as I've been suggesting, and a number of scholars see this, as a religion of empire versus religion of creation message. Although most scholars don't use that language because that's my particular language. But the point being that what we saw in 1 Kings 3 on the dream and other elements, including in David's passing on of messages, that Solomon has got David's approval to be king, and he's also got Yahweh's approval to be king. And so when he engages in the forced labor here, that appears to be Yahweh's will. But what we'll see, the forced labor in Exodus is plainly not described as Yahweh's will. It's oppressing the Israelites, and it'll lead to Moses leading them out. And we'll see there are many parallels there. So before we get into some of those parallels, the shape of our passage, we looked at this chiasm last time of the exchange at a distance of proposals. And what we'll see is actually Solomon won. Solomon said, why don't we do it together? He said, my slaves will join your slaves, as you see up here. But Hiram said, I will fulfill all your delights. I will have done it. I will do it. But in the end, we'll see they did it together. Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gibeonites, whoever they are exactly, worked together. So although we don't see negotiations to get to that point, apparently Solomon won that somehow, and suggesting that Solomon has authority over Hiram, even though historically Tyre is a much greater and certainly more ancient and widespread imperial presence than what Solomon rules over in Jerusalem. And we'll see more of that as we get into the further building sections. But what we see here in our first verse is this, and notice what a radical shift it is. We saw here they cut a covenant, and now we see this right after. As Ellen Davis notes below, the picture of a temple built on oppression stands in complete contrast to the equally detailed description of the building of the wilderness tabernacle in Exodus, where women and men brought materials with wise and willing hearts and hands. And we can look back at one of these elements here. I didn't put that in my chart, but we can see here in Exodus 35 exactly what she's talking about. Take from among you an offering to Yahweh. Let whoever is of a generous heart bring the Lord's offering, gold, silver, and bronze, and all these pieces. And as you can see, as it goes down farther, not only they do it, they bring more, everyone. And they came, everyone whose heart was stirred and everyone whose spirit was willing, and brought the Lord's offering to be used for the tent of meeting. And eventually, the text says, they brought so many things that they had to turn them away because there was too much. So here it's being brought voluntarily, but what we see in the king story is Solomon is assembling forced labor. So going back to our story, one of the things we have to ask is, how did he do this? The word for conscripted here, hard to pronounce without the vowels here, but viol in the form we have it, can mean gathered together in a more benign sense than conscripted. But conscripted does raise the question of how did he get 30,000 men to agree to do what he said? Sure, he's the king, but Saul didn't get easy agreement from everybody, and sometimes David didn't either. After all, his son Absalom rebelled against him and brought many of the Israelites along with him, rebelling against the king. So we have no reason to think that Solomon has befriended people. David seemed at least to express some kind of a warmth, and he sung and he played music, and that brought many people around to him. But King Solomon has shown no personality at all. He's simply a bureaucrat sitting on the throne, first executing the assignment of his father to literally execute people, and then this situation with Hiram after the negotiation of the maternity suit between the two street prostitutes, which I explained at the time, is symbolic of his wisdom to hold Israel and Judah together, the expression of the two prostitutes as Israel and Judah, and the babies as the expression of the two different monarchies of Saul and David. So Solomon hasn't done anything that we know of that's led him to be in good spirit with the people. And we'll see, as I've already shown in the introductory video, that when the ceremony for celebrating the temple comes, he leads all the elders and the leaders around him. So he's certainly concerned with the elite. But here it's not the elite. And the term for forced labor, mas, and very clearly out of all Israel, Mikal Yisrael. And that's really important because the text will later disclaim it. And I'll show that in the text we'll see on forced labor in just a moment. We'll look at all these passages. See, my note below has note how this comes right after the description of all the wealth available to Solomon to pay workers if he'd wanted to establish justice. As we saw here, he agreed to pay Hiram whatever it was that he asked for. Right here, I'll give you whatever wages you set for your slaves. And here he's doing it for, we don't know what he's paying them. These are not chattel slaves like American black slavery. These are forced labor. So presumably they're being paid something. And that's what my further note below has. The force was forced labor, not slave labor. But Lisa Beale notes this passage in chapter 9, and we'll just look at that briefly now because it claims the exact opposite. It says, this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the house, etc. But then it says he didn't conscript them from the Israelites. As you can see down below here, talking about the people of the land in a very Deuteronomistic phrase. This list is very similar to Deuteronomy 7, the people you're supposed to destroy. But here their descendants were still left in the land, whom the Israelites were unable to destroy, though Solomon conscripted them for slave labor. But of the Israelites, Solomon made no slaves. They were his soldiers, his officials, etc. But back here it says very explicitly that he conscripted slave labor out of all Israel. And as the story continues here, it's not really a story, as the description continues, it reinforces that because he's got Adoniram in charge of it. But can one man in charge of it really get 30,000 people to cooperate? Notice how he's sending them in shifts, 10,000 a month, or literally each moon, in shifts. The word for shifts here, haliphath, is otherwise used for changing clothes, for garments, and Joseph in Genesis 45, and for Samson here, and another changes of clothes. So it has to do with a changing. Here it's a changing of the workers and not a changing of clothes, an interesting use of that. They would be in a month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of it. Notice we don't know at this point that Hiram's people are also part of that. It just seems like Solomon is sending his people to do it, even after Hiram said, I will do it. This work is in the Lebanon to be doing the woodworking, but the stone cutting is in the land of Israel, as we'll see in a moment. So before I get too far into the text, let's look at the context of forced labor in the Bible and see what that's saying about Solomon and Pharaoh. So I've color-coded this, as you can see in the lining below. The blue is unrelated to 1 Kings. The green here for Deuteronomy and Josiah are text from, Deuteronomy and Joshua are text from the Josiah era, roughly 630 or so BCE, so near the end of the monarchy. And if you're not sure about why Josiah is the author of these texts, go back and watch my introductory video, and we talk about that there. But notice here, it's always about other forced labor. It's about Canaanites, etc. And one of the big issues in the Josiah story is making sure that the people in Judah and Jerusalem are pure in the sense of their ethnicity, but also in the sense of who and where they worship. We won't get into all the details of that now. But the pink sections here are related to ours. So here's the classic Exodus story from Exodus 1:11. Therefore, the Egyptians set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, using the same word mas here. They built storage cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. And down here we see the account of the forced labor of King Solomon, the passage I just looked at, where it said they were not of the people of Israel, but they built all of Solomon's storage cities, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his cavalry, and whatever else Solomon desired to build. So he has forced labor, not only building the temple, not only building his own house, not only building the house for the daughter of Pharaoh, but multiple storage cities, more cities just for chariots, and cities just for his horses and the stalls of horses. We'll how many he had away later when we look at the comparison with Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20, the so-called Torah of the king. So plainly, there's this explicit connection here about forced labor between Solomon and Pharaoh. What does that lead to? Let's go down a little bit more. We see at the very end of the story, the man Jeroboam, who will be the one who will lead the Israelites in rebellion against Solomon's son Rehoboam, was very able. And when Solomon saw the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over the forced labor of the house of Joseph, which is to say Israel. So Jeroboam starts off somewhat like Moses in the favor of Solomon or in favor of Pharaoh, and yet he ends up leading a rebellion. So let's look at the comparison here. I didn't show this in my introductory video, but this is table 4 from Come Out My People, and I've posted a number of these other tables at radicalbible.net, so even if you don't have my book, you can access these tables. And the important point are two things. We've already seen the wisdom, Hakmah, of God was in him, and it's only of Solomon in 1st and 2nd Kings, as I noted at the time. But here, the same word Hakmah is used for how the Egyptians are going to deal with the Israelites, translated as shrewdly. I noted in the last video in the Exodus story, and we'll see it again, it's sometimes translated as skill, that all the people of skill, Hakmah, contributed to the work of building the tabernacle, as opposed to Hiram and all these forced laborers. But here we see the immediate connection. So as we saw in 4:6, and then it's also noting our passage right here in 5:27 and 28, that's counting the Hebrew numbers, which I've been noting are 14 verses off the English. So 15:14 on the left side is actually 15:28 in the Hebrew. In chapter 6, it'll go back to matching. But then 9:15, the passage I just showed as the summary of that in 21, and then one other reference. But here we see the exact same word used for what Pharaoh did. It's only here in Exodus. So it's a rare word, and I just showed you how many times it came up in this chart here, not that many, and it connects them together. But it not only connects them together, we can also see the parallels between Moses and Jeroboam. So we don't know much about Jeroboam in terms of my going through the story. We've not gotten to there yet when the rebellion comes, and you can see the references here. But notice all these parallels between Moses and rebellion. Let's go over them just for a minute so you can see it if you're not familiar with the story that unfolds in 1 Kings. So first, it's the new king enslaves the population, and we've seen that here. The hero, which is to say Jeroboam or Moses, brought into the royal court as a royal servant to an oppressive Pharaoh, and that's, again, what we just saw about Jeroboam. The hero lives in exile, and we'll find out where does Jeroboam go when Solomon sees him as an enemy? To Egypt. He finds himself going to Egypt. And then there's the return after Pharaoh's death, which is to say the return after Solomon's death. We'll look at that in a minute. A successful rebellion and flight. Moses leads them out of Egypt, and Jeroboam leads them out of Jerusalem and Judah. In addition, Midian is a refuge, both for Moses while he's awaiting Pharaoh's death, and also in another passage just before Jeroboam. Another curious coincidence that can't just be a coincidence is that in Exodus, Aaron's sons are Nadab and Abihu, and Jeroboam's sons are Nadab and Abijah, which is awfully close and seems, more than coincidental. So what we're looking at is this. We're looking at an allegory, that the book of Exodus is portraying an allegory of 3 pharaohs that match 3 kings, David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. So the pharaohs are never named, and that's certainly one element that takes them out of the historical context of real pharaohs. There are pharaohs who are named in 1 Kings, as we'll see, actual historical people. But the ones in the Exodus story are abstract. They're just the office holders. We could simply say the king of Egypt, and sometimes it simply does say the king of Egypt. So the first one that we see at the end of Genesis, the Joseph story in Genesis, is certainly later than the rest of the book of Genesis, mostly from exile or the time after exile under Persian rule. So we see there, Pharaoh welcomes Joseph. And I've noted in my Genesis series, if the Genesis story had known the Exodus story, it would be really surprising that Pharaoh would be welcoming the Israelites. This is a misspelling of Pharaoh, by the way. It's spelled correctly this way with the A before the O. I'll correct that before I post it at radicalbible.net. So Pharaoh in the book of Genesis and Exodus welcomes Joseph and his sons and has them settle there. That's Israel. They're not called Israel there. They're called the sons of Jacob. But plainly, the nation of Israel is the sons of Jacob according to Genesis that creates that reality. They leads them into Egypt. And we'll look at the map in a moment and just to see how that plays out. Then that Pharaoh dies, and as the the text of Exodus says another Pharaoh came along who didn't know Joseph, and he was afraid of the Israelites, and so he controlled them. And that's Solomon here. And Solomon has control over Judah, but we don't know anything about his relationship with Israel. And we know that Israel only covenanted with David to be king after Absalom was gone in the end, but before that, after Saul and Saul's people were gone in the beginning. So they were reluctant, but they realized they had little choice. And perhaps that's the case of Israel now, because as soon as Solomon's dead, Israel with Jeroboam will come to Rehoboam and say, "Your father was harsh on us." And that leads to this situation. So Rehoboam plays the third Pharaoh, the one that after Moses runs away, finds out and goes to discovers Yahweh at the burning bush and goes back and then confronts him. And then we have the great plagues and the march out. And that's very similar here to how Rehoboam faces Jeroboam, who demands that it not be so harsh. And Rehoboam says, no, it'll be harsher, and off they go. So what we're seeing here is a religion of empire story justifying Solomon's harsh rule, and a religion of creation story justifying rebellion against such harsh rule. So that's the story and counter story that we're looking at here in 1 Kings, and obviously not in as much detail in Exodus. Let's see how the religion of empire story plays out in our immediate scene. And I highlighted here the emphasis on thousands. And this certainly is all kinds of exaggeration. This is the two generations from Saul, who was a king over just local cities, and it was really more of a family affair and family of friends, just a couple of local towns and their local population. Jerusalem, by all accounts, must have been only a small town. Even in Roman times, the estimate is that apart from festival times, it was probably 50 or 60,000 total. And Jerusalem was certainly the largest city in the land. So where he's getting all these people from, who knows? And what's the mechanism for how he makes that happen? One more thing before we look at that. He sent them to the Lebanon, but all these people are doing it in the land. And one thing we need to look at is both where that stone cutting is, but where the Exodus takes place. And although we might picture Egypt and the Nile Delta, that's actually not what the books of Exodus and Numbers tell us. Looking at this map here, you can see that mostly it's in the Sinai Peninsula. And certainly Mount Sinai is obviously not in Egypt. They'd escaped from Egypt. But as many scholars have noted, the actual map of the Exodus, as portrayed in Exodus, suggests they were simply in the southern part of the land, that they're in land that Egypt controlled, but they're not formally in the land of Egypt. Egypt had power over a great swath of land, much as many empires did at the time, including Babylon, whose control went all the way up to Haran, just north of what's now Israel, or was Israel in the biblical time. So a long way from the Tigris and Euphrates was still the control of Babylon. So the southern Sinai Peninsula area was in the control of Egypt, but wasn't the actual nation of Egypt, and it suggests that it's consistent with the idea that they're rebelling from a leader in Jerusalem, not necessarily someone farther down in Egypt, that Egypt is a symbol for Solomon's harshness. So let's look at some more of the details of what is described here. So moving back to verse 15, we count 180,000 workers who are described here. And that certainly can't be all the people. Presumably these are all male workers. Where are the women and children? Plainly, there couldn't have been that many people at any time in Israel's history, really until the modern nation state of Israel. Why those big numbers? Perhaps simply to show Solomon's great power? Let's look at a little more detail here. So you had 7,000 described here as laborers, but literally they are burden bearers, or Coogan suggests basket carriers, so people moving things around. So those are folks moving much of the work and stuff that has to be around. And 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, or in the mountain. Literally the word is har here for mountain. Here's an image of some of the great stone that could be around that area. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem or seen at least the so-called Wailing Wall, the remaining wall of the Second Temple, you could certainly see those big stones. And they certainly weren't moving all those stones from the Lebanon. The wood, as Hiram suggested, could be floated down as a raft and broken up at shore. But moving these gigantic stones around would not be like that. And we'll see in the description just how large they're described in terms of cubits. So 70,000 of those 80,000 stone cutters. It's really hard to imagine that. But when you look at this picture from the 1700s, you can see some sense of at least an artistic image of how widespread all this work was. And not only that, now we see 3,300, an odd number, supervisors, literally missari, which is a generic word for royal delegates or retainers. So it could be people in any role, often as officials. But because they're over the work using a pronoun that suggests that, these are the ones supervising How much? All of this? These 70 and 850,000 and these 30,000, or at least 10,000 at a time? How are 3,300 workers overseeing all that many people? Where are they? There must be some tremendous bureaucracy to make this all work, to organize all those people, but we don't hear anything about that. But then we hear a little more in verse 17. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with what's described here as dressed stones, but otherwise is described as hewn stones. And many times in the prophets, we won't look at it now, building with hewn stones is precisely an expression of luxury, that you're living in a house made of hewn stones while your workers are starving. We can see here in Exodus 20:25, Yahweh's word here, if you make for me an altar of stone, do not build it of hewn stones, for if you use a chisel upon it, you profane it. Which is to say that if what God has created, the actual stone, is marked by humans, then it becomes a human product. It's part of the same reality that makes the biblical tradition aniconic. There'll be no, quote, graven images in the Old King James language, which is say carved, or you could even expand to painted or human-created images. In other words, you will not make something physically that's an expression of God. But there is going to be a temple, and that's a question of how that plays out in relation to the Exodus story. So this is to make an altar, not a home. So hewn stones from the larger tradition could be seen as a negative thing here, but here they're suggested as an expression of luxury. And so we reach the end of our immediate section where we hear this surprising coda. Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Giblites, literally the men of Gibal, a city north of Tyre and Sidon that Joshua had not been able to take, according to Joshua 13:5, known for its timber works, according to Lisa Ray Beal down here. We know nothing otherwise about that, though. So they've got some kind of hired help and all their builders, so 180-something thousand of Solomon's people, how many of Hiram's people, and now they're prepared to build it. And so what we'll see in chapter 6 and 7, we won't go over in detail as we've been doing here. We'll look at it more in comparison with the Mishkan and consider what this is saying for the tradition, the biblical tradition, to have both these stories there and lead people to decide what the relationship between them is. That's where we'll go next time. See you then.